The silence in the dining room was so heavy, it felt like it could crush the fine china on the table. The smoke from the candles I had just blown out was still curling up towards the chandelier, a thin gray ribbon dancing in the stillness. I looked at the faces around me, my 5 children. Grown adults with graying hair and wrinkles of their own, looking at me with smiles that were slowly starting to freeze, cracking like ice on a pond. I cleared my throat, and the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I am 73 years old today," I said, my voice trembling not with age, but with the sheer force of the adrenaline pumping through my tired veins. "You all surprised me with this party, with the balloons and this beautiful cake. But when I blew out the candles, I didn't wish for more time. I didn't wish for health." I looked them dead in the eyes. I said, "My wish is that you finally know the truth." My hand went into my large knitting bag sitting on the floor beside me. I pulled them out. 5 thick white envelopes. I placed them on the lace tablecloth, one by one, slapping them down with a rhythm that echoed in the silence. Each one had a name written in my shaky cursive: Maria, Roberto, Elena, Lucas, Daniel. "Inside these envelopes are DNA tests," I whispered, watching the confusion cloud their eyes. "And the results prove one thing. None of you belong to the man you have called Dad for 50 years. But wait, how did we get to this moment? How does an old woman decide to burn down her entire family history over a slice of birthday cake? Let me tell you from the beginning, before the guests arrived, before the cake was cut, back when the house was still quiet. The morning started with the ache in my hip, the one that tells me it is going to rain or that trouble is coming." I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, just listening to the old house breathe. The floorboards settled with a groan, much like I did. I looked at the dress I had laid out the night before. It was a navy blue silk dress, the one with the high collar that hides the loose skin on my neck. It looked like armor. That is what I needed today. Armor. I walked over to the vanity table, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The mirrors showed me a woman I sometimes barely recognize. White hair, deep lines etched around a mouth that has stayed shut for too long. I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, moving aside the piles of winter scarves and old handkerchiefs that smelled of dried lavender and mothballs. My hands were shaking as I reached for the plastic folder hidden underneath. It felt heavy, heavier than paper should be. It felt like I was lifting a tombstone. I took out the 5 envelopes. I had read them 100 times, memorized every percentage, every scientific term that confirmed what I had known in my heart for decades. I sat there, tracing the names of my children with a thumb that was swollen from arthritis. I thought about the man they mourned, the man whose portrait hung in Paulway, looking stern and respectable. They worshipped him. They thought he was a saint who worked hard for his family. They didn't know about the bruises he left on my arms, that I hid with long sleeves even in summer. They didn't know about the coldness, the mockery, the way he made me feel small so he could feel big. I could hear the sounds of the catering staff arriving downstairs. The clinking of silverware, the heavy thud of crates being set down. The world was moving forward, preparing for a celebration, while I was stuck in the past, holding a grenade in my lap. I got dressed slowly. Every button I fastened felt like I was sealing my fate. I put on my pearl necklace, the one he gave me after Daniel was born, a gift that was really a bribe for my silence regarding his late nights. The pearls felt cold against my skin, like little beads of ice. I went downstairs. The house smelled of lemon polish and roasting meat. It was a smell that usually brought me comfort, the smell of home, But today, it made my stomach turn. I walked into the dining room. The table was already set. Crystal glasses sparkled under the lights, waiting to be filled with expensive wine. It looked perfect. It looked like a lie. I sat in my usual chair at the head of the table. My daughter, Maria, came rushing in from the kitchen, her heels clicking rapidly. She looked so stressed, checking the placement of the napkins. "Mom, you are down early," she said, giving me a quick, distracted kiss on the cheek. Her perfume was strong, something floral and expensive. She didn't look at me, really. She was looking at the table, at the perfection of it all. "Everything has to be perfect for your 73rd, she said, adjusting a fork by a millimeter. "Dad would have wanted." The mention of his name made my jaw tighten. Dad would have wanted. That is all I ever heard. Dad would have wanted the business to go this way. Dad would have wanted us to spend holidays at the lake. Even from the grave, he was directing our lives. I gripped the armrest of my chair. My handbag was at my feet, the envelopes inside burning a hole through the leather. "Maria," I said softly. She hummed in response, not stopping her frantic adjustments. "Do you remember when you were 10 and you wanted to take piano lessons?" She paused, looking at me with a confused frown. "What? Yes, vaguely. Dad said I didn't have the hands for it, that it was a waste of money." I nodded. "He told you that you were clumsy, that you had no rhythm." I watched her face. The memory was there, a shadow behind her eyes. It still hurt her, 40 years later. "I wanted you to play," I told her. "I had the money saved from the grocery budget, but he found it." Maria sighed, smoothing her skirt. "Mom, why bring this up now? It's a party. Let's not dwell on the past. Dad was just practical. He wanted us to be tough." Tough. That was the word they used to excuse his cruelty. They thought his harshness was a lesson, not a flaw. They thought his distance was strength. They didn't know that the reason he looked at them with such detachment wasn't because he was a stoic patriarch, but because deep down, he knew. He knew they weren't his, and he hated them for it, and he hated me even more. But he was too proud to admit it to the world. He preferred to play the king in his castle, tormenting us in private while receiving applause in public. More cars started pulling into the driveway. I could hear the slam of doors, the muffled voices of my grandchildren running on the lawn. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't just an old woman anymore. I was a judge, a jury, and an executioner. I looked at the empty chair at the other end of the table. I imagined his ghost sitting there, smirking at me, daring me to destroy the perfect image he had built. Lucas walked in next, looking tired. He runs the company now. He looks so much like his biological father, a gentleman who worked at the library, a man who actually listened when I spoke. Lucas has his eyes. Soft, brown eyes that always look a bit sad. "Happy birthday, Mama," he said, hugging me gently. He smelled of tobacco and rain. He felt thin. The stress of living up to the family name was eating him alive. He was trying to be a shark because he thought he was the son of a shark, but he was born a dolphin. "Thank you, mijo," I whispered, holding him a little tighter than usual. I was about to free him. I was about to break his heart to save his soul. The room filled up quickly. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation. I sat there, smiling, nodding, accepting gifts wrapped in shiny paper. A silk scarf. A new tablet I would never use. A photo album. I touched their hands, their faces. I felt like a spy in my own life. They toasted to me, to Louisa, the matriarch, the rock of the family. They toasted to the memory of their father. I took a sip of water, my throat so dry it felt like sandpaper. Then came the cake. A massive thing, covered in white frosting and 73 candles. It took 3 of my grandchildren to carry it in. Everyone started singing, "Happy birthday to you." The sound was deafening. It distorted in my ears, sounding like a warped record. I looked at the flames flickering on the cake. 73 little fires. 73 years of silence. I took a deep breath. The smell of the burning wax was sharp and chemical. "Make a wish, Mom!" Elena shouted from the back, holding her glass up. "Make a wish!" the grandchildren chanted. I looked at the envelopes in my bag. I looked at the ghost at the end of the table. I blew out the candles. And in the sudden smoke, I knew there was no turning back. The room did not explode with noise immediately. It was quite the opposite. It was as if I had sucked all the oxygen out of the dining room with my dying breath, leaving a vacuum where sound could not travel. The smoke from the 73 candles drifted lazily into the faces of my children, carrying that acrid scent of extinguished fire that always reminds me of endings, of things burning out. I kept my hand on the envelopes. My skin looked so translucent against the stark white paper, like parchment stretched over old bones. I could feel the texture of the envelopes under my fingertips, the slight grit of the paper, the weight of the secrets inside them. Maria was the first to move. Of course she was. She is the one who fixes things, the one who sweeps the dust under the rug so the house looks clean for guests. She let out a laugh, but it was a brittle, jagged sound, like glass breaking under a heavy boot. She reached out, her hand hovering over the table, her perfectly manicured red nails trembling just slightly. "Mom," she said, her voice pitched too high, a nervous trill that grated on my ears. "That is a terrible joke. Really, Mom." "Is this part of a game? A murder mystery game for your birthday?" She looked around at her siblings, desperate for them to join her in this delusion. "Come on, everyone, laugh! Mom is playing a prank on her old age." I did not smile. I did not blink. I felt a cold calmness settle over me, a strange contrast to the fire burning in my chest. "I am not playing a game, Maria," I said, and my voice sounded raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. I pushed the envelopes forward. Just an inch, but the movement made everyone flinch as if I had brandished a knife. "Look at them. Look at the names." Roberto, my eldest, the one who tries so hard to emulate the man he thought was his father, slammed his hand down on the table. The silverware jumped. The wine in the glasses rippled, a dark blood-red tide. "Stop it," he barked. His face was flushing a deep, angry crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his starch-stiff collar. "How dare you?" "On his birthday? Well, your birthday, but in his house? How dare you disrespect Dad like this? He was a great man. He gave us everything. He worked himself into an early grave for this family." I looked at Roberto. I saw the anger in his jaw. The same jawline that belonged to a spirited Italian mechanic I met in the summer of 1955, not the square, rigid jaw of my late husband. Roberto didn't know that his temper, his passion, his love for fixing things with his hands came from a man who loved me with a tenderness I had never known before or since. He thought he was defending a saint, but he was defending a jailer. "He didn't give you everything, Roberto," I said softly, looking him straight in the eyes. I saw his gaze waver. "He gave you money. He gave you a name. But did he ever give you his time? Did he ever look at you with anything other than disappointment?" The room went deadly quiet again. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting away the seconds of our old lives. Tick, tock, a lie, a truth. Lucas, my sweet Lucas, was pale. He had sunk back into his chair, looking small. He was the one who suffered the most under the weight of expectation. He was an artist at heart, forced into a suit, forced to run a company that crushed his spirit daily. He stared at the envelope with his name on it as if it were a poisonous spider. "Mom?" he whispered, and the pain in his voice nearly broke my resolve. "Why? Why tell us this now? After all these years? Why not take this to the grave?" I felt tears prick my eyes, hot and stinging. This was the question I had wrestled with for nights on end, staring at the ceiling while the rain lashed against the window. Why hurt them? Why destroy their foundation? "Because I am tired of the lies, Lucas," I said, my voice cracking. I looked at all of them. I saw the confusion, the hurt, the brewing storm. Because for 50 years, I watched that man treat you all like employees rather than children. I watched him criticize your nose, Elena, which is just like your real father's. I watched him mock your sensitivity, Daniel. He knew. Deep down, he suspected, and he punished you for it every single day. He punished me, and you all worshipped him for it because you thought he was just being strong. I cannot die letting you believe that his coldness was love. It wasn't love. It was resentment. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. My granddaughter, little Sophia, tugged on Maria's sleeve. "Mommy, why is Grandma crying?" she asked, her innocent voice cutting through the tension. Maria shushed her aggressively, pushing the child toward the nanny standing in the corner. "Take the kids outside," she hissed, "now." As the children were ushered out, looking back with wide, frightened eyes, the atmosphere in the room grew darker, more adult, more dangerous. The facade of the happy birthday party had melted away like the wax on the cake, leaving only the hard, ugly wick exposed. Elena reached out and touched the corner of her envelope. She didn't pick it up. She just touched it, testing its reality. So she started, her voice shaking. Who? Who are they? If if he wasn't our father, then who? Were there 5 different men? I nodded slowly. The shame that society tells me I should feel was nowhere to be found. Instead, I felt a fierce protectiveness. I was a woman starved of affection, living in a cold marble mausoleum of a marriage. I found warmth where I could. I found humanity in the arms of men who saw me, who heard me. "Yes," I said, 5 men, 5 good men, men who had hearts, not stones in their chests. I looked at Lucas. "Your father was a librarian. He read poetry to me in the park." "That is why you love books, mijo. That is why you feel things so deeply. It is not a weakness, like my husband told you. It is your inheritance." Lucas let out a sob, a raw sound that he quickly tried to stifle with his hand. He looked at the portrait of my husband hanging on the wall, the stern oil painting that loomed over us. He looked back at me, his eyes swimming with a mixture of grief and liberation. "But this is insanity!" Roberto stood up, his chair scraping violently against the parquet floor. He began to pace the length of the rug, running his hands through his thinning hair. "You are telling us that we are bastards? That we have no claim to this family name? To the company? Do you realize what you are doing, Mother? You are invalidating our entire lives. You are destroying the legacy." "Legacy." I spat the word out. I found strength in my legs and stood up, leaning heavily on the table. My hips screamed in protest, a sharp, biting pain, but I ignored it. What legacy, Roberto? The legacy of an ulcer? The legacy of high blood pressure and misery? Look at you. You are 52 years old and you look 70. You have spent your whole life trying to please a ghost who never liked you. I grabbed the envelope with his name and held it out to him. My hand was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline starting to mix with exhaustion. Inside this envelope is a swab test from a man named Antonio. He was a mechanic. He had grease under his fingernails and a laugh that could shake a room. He fixed my car when your father wouldn't let me spend money on repairs. He was kind. He was alive. You have his fire, Roberto. Stop using it to burn yourself alive trying to be someone else. Roberto stared at the envelope. His chest was heaving. He looked like he wanted to strike me, or hug me, or collapse. The conflict in his eyes was terrible to witness. The silence stretched again, taut as a violin string about to snap. Daniel, the youngest, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. He sat at the far end of the table, swirling the ice in his empty glass. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. "I always knew," he said quietly. Everyone turned to him. The shock on Maria's face was almost comical. "What?" she screeched. "I knew I didn't belong," Daniel continued, his voice monotone. "I never felt like him. I never looked like him. And Mom," he looked at me, his eyes sad and knowing, "I saw you once, years ago, at the station, with a man." I froze. I remembered the station. I remembered the hurried goodbye, the desperate clasping of hands through a train window. "Why didn't you say anything?" Maria demanded, turning on her brother. "Because I wanted to survive," Daniel shrugged. "We all did." I sank back into my chair, my energy draining away rapidly. The cake sat in the middle of the table, a ruin of sugar and expectations. The icing had started to slide off the side, creating a sweet, sticky puddle on the lace tablecloth I had hand-washed for 40 years. It seemed fitting. The pristine image of our family was finally stained. "Read them," I whispered, closing my eyes for a moment. I could hear the rustle of paper. I could hear the sharp intake of breath. Or, don't read them. Burn them if you want to keep living the lie. But I could not blow out those candles and make a fake wish. I am 73. I do not have time for fake wishes anymore. The sound of tearing paper filled the room. It was a loud, violent sound in the quiet dining room. Rip. One. Then another. Rip. Then a pause. Then a gasp. I opened my eyes. Maria was holding her results. Her face had lost all its color. She was reading the paper, her lips moving silently. She looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the judgmental matriarch in training. I saw my little girl, confused and scared. "Mom," she whispered, the paper shaking in her hand, This says he is still alive." I nodded, feeling a tear finally escape and track a cold path down my wrinkled cheek. Yes, he is. The room felt small, intimate, and terrifying. The ghost of my husband had been banished from the table, replaced by the very real, very complicated truth of 5 strangers who were now woven into the fabric of our lives. The aroma of the roast beef was now cold and heavy, unappetizing. The party was over. The real gathering had just begun. Roberto was still standing, holding his unopened envelope. He looked at it, then at the portrait of the man on the wall, then back at the envelope. His hands were fists. He was the barrier. He was the wall I had to break down. "Open it, Roberto," I said, my voice barely a murmur. "Set yourself free." He looked at me with a hatred that I knew was just grief turned inside out. "If I open this," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and it says what you say it says, then everything I have done, every sacrifice I made for this family, for his approval, it was for nothing." "Not for nothing," I said. "You did it for family. But now you get to choose which family that is." He hooked his finger under the flap of the envelope. The sound of him tearing it open was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It sounded like the roof of the house collapsing. He pulled out the paper. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page. I watched his face, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the moment the son of the mechanic would finally meet himself. I am 73 years old, and as I watched my eldest son stare at a piece of paper, I realized that for the vast majority of those years, I had been holding my breath. My family had surprised me with a birthday party, a celebration of a life that was mostly a fabrication. But when I blew out the candles and told them my wish was for the truth, I didn't know if the walls of this house would stand. Now, as Roberto read the words that unmade his universe, the silence was so absolute I could hear the wax dripping from the candles onto the sugar roses of the cake. Roberto's eyes stopped moving. The paper rattled in his grip like a dry leaf in a winter gale. He didn't scream. He didn't flip the heavy oak table. He simply crumbled. It was a slow, terrifying implosion. His shoulders, usually so square and stiff in his expensive suit, slumped forward as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He sat down heavily, the chair groaning under his weight, and the sound echoed in the cavernous dining room like a gunshot. He looked up at me, and the arrogance was gone. The mask of the CEO, the head of the family, the weary successor, it had all slipped off. He looked like a boy who had just scraped his knee. "Antonio," he choked out, the name foreign and familiar on his tongue. "The mechanic?" "Yes," I answered, my hands clasping together on the table to stop them from shaking. "Antonio. The man who taught you how to whistle. The man who let you sit in the front seat of his truck and pretend to drive." Roberto let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He rubbed his face with his palm, smearing the sweat on his forehead. "I remember the smell of grease," he whispered, staring at nothing. "I remember he had a scar on his thumb. He gave me a metal toy car. Dad, the man I called Dad, he threw it away. He said it was dirty. He said it was trash." "He was jealous," I said, my voice soft but firm. "He was jealous because you looked at Antonio with a light in your eyes that he could never buy from you. You have Antonio's hands, Roberto. Look at them." Roberto looked down at his broad, capable hands. He had spent his life forcing them to sign contracts and hold fountain pens, but they were hands meant to build, to fix, to create. He began to weep, deep, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. It was an ugly, raw sound, the sound of 50 years of grief finally finding an exit. He wasn't crying for the father he lost. He was crying for the man he was never allowed to be. Across the table, Maria was still staring at her paper. She had gone from shock to a frantic, feverish focus. She was the organizer, the one who needed control, and her world had just spun off its axis. She looked at me, her mascara slightly smudged beneath her left eye, ruining her perfection. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling, "this name, Julian, it says here he lives in the city. It gives an address." She looked up, her eyes wide with panic and hope. Is he really just across town?" "He is a piano teacher, Maria," I told her. I watched her face soften. He plays with a passion that would make you cry. That rhythm you have, the one your father mocked, it comes from him. He never married. He asks about you every year." Maria pressed the paper to her chest, closing her eyes. A piano teacher. All those years she spent trying to learn economics to please a man who thought she was useless when her soul wanted music. She looked at her hands, imagining them on keys instead of calculators. The anger in her face dissolved into a profound, aching sadness. Elena, my middle child, the one who always felt ugly because her nose was too strong and her laugh too loud for our refined household, finally reached for her envelope. She did it quickly, ripping it open like a Band-Aid. She read the contents, and a strange expression crossed her face. A smile. A small, confused, genuine smile. "A baker?" she asked, looking at me. "My father was a baker?" I nodded. He had a bakery on 4th Street. He smelled like yeast and cinnamon. He was the warmest man I ever knew. And he thought you were the most beautiful baby he had ever seen. He loved your nose, Elena. He said it gave you character. He said it made you look like a queen. Elena touched her face, her fingers tracing the bridge of her nose that she had hated for 4 decades. Tears spilled over her cheeks, but she was smiling. She looked at the portrait of the man on the wall, the man who had suggested she get surgery when she was 16, and she laughed. It was a free, loud laugh. "He was wrong," she said to the painting. "You were wrong." The room was transforming. The air, previously thick with the stale tension of duty and expectation, was now charged with something volatile but alive. The ghost of my husband was fading, his power evaporating with every tear my children shed. But there was still Lucas. My sweet Lucas sat quietly, his envelope already open on his lap. He hadn't said a word since the revelation about his librarian father. He was staring at his siblings, watching their foundations shatter and reform. He stood up slowly. He looked thin in his suit, too fragile for the corporate world he had been thrust into. He walked over to me. The room went silent again as he approached. He knelt beside my chair, ignoring the dust on the floor, ignoring the creak of his knees. He took my weathered hands in his. "Thank you," he whispered. The others looked at him in shock. Roberto wiped his eyes, confused. "Thank her?" Roberto asked, his voice hoarse. "She just destroyed us, Lucas. She just told us our lies." "No," Lucas said, turning to look at his brother. "She just told us the truth. Don't you feel it, Roberto?" He tapped his chest. "The pressure? It's gone. I don't have to be him. I don't have to be the ruthless businessman. I'm the son of a man who loved poetry. I'm allowed to be soft." He turned back to me, his brown eyes filled with a gratitude that pierced my heart. "You carried this alone," he said. "For all of us. You let him hate you. You let him treat you like furniture, just to keep us safe, to keep a roof over our heads. But you saved the pieces of us that mattered. I couldn't hold it back anymore." The stoic mask I had worn for the last hour, the mask of the judge, finally cracked. I leaned forward and rested my forehead against Lucas's shoulder, sobbing into the expensive fabric of his jacket. I smelled the tobacco and rain on him, but underneath, I smelled the baby I had rocked to sleep while crying because I couldn't tell him who he really was. "I'm sorry," I wept. "I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was so afraid. He was so powerful. He would have taken you away from me. He threatened me, you know. He said if I ever left, I would never see any of you again. So I stayed. I stayed, and I let him kill my spirit so he wouldn't kill yours." "Mama," Roberto said from the table. His voice was different now. It was the voice of a man, not a subordinate. He stood up and walked over, placing his heavy hand on my back. It was warm. He wasn't shaking anymore. "We aren't a dynasty," Daniel said from the corner, his voice cutting through the emotion. He held up his glass in a mock toast. "We're a mess. We're a glorious, illegitimate mess." And for the first time in 40 years, laughter rang out in that dining room that didn't feel forced. It was hysterical, tear-filled, painful laughter, but it was real. We were surrounded by the wreckage of our identity. The birthday cake was a sugary disaster, the coffee was cold, the servants were probably whispering in the kitchen. But as I looked around at my children, the mechanic's son, the piano teacher's daughter, the baker's girl, the librarian's boy, and the drifter's son, I realized they looked more like themselves than they ever had before. But reality has a way of snapping back like a rubber band. As the emotional wave crested and began to recede, the practical implications started to settle in the room like dust. Roberto straightened up, wiping his face with a handkerchief. He looked at the DNA test again, then at me. His expression hardened, not with cruelty this time, but with a serious, protective intensity. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "does anyone else know? The lawyers? The board of directors?" "No," I said, lifting my head, "just us, and the men, but they promised silence. They loved you enough to let you go." Roberto nodded, his mind already racing, the mechanic's ingenuity merging with the CEO's training. "If this gets out, we lose the company. The trust funds are tied to his bloodline. The grandfather clauses? We could lose everything. The house, the assets." I looked at the opulent room, at the crystal chandelier that I had always hated because it was impossible to clean. Let it go, I wanted to say, but I knew it wasn't that simple. They had families, they had debts, they had lives built on this money. "We don't have to tell the world," Maria said sharply, her survival instinct kicking back in. She grabbed her envelope and shoved it into her purse. "This is our truth. It doesn't belong to the shareholders." "But it changes everything," Lucas said softly. "I can't go back to that office, Roberto. I can't pretend to be his son anymore. I quit." Roberto looked at Lucas, and for a second I thought he would argue. I thought he would bully him back into line, but he just nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay, we'll figure it out. I'll figure it out." Then the heavy oak doors of the dining room creaked open. We all froze. The nanny poked her head in, looking terrified. "Excuse me, Mrs. Louisa," she squeaked, "but there is a car outside, a police car, and a man in a suit. He says he needs to speak with the executor of the estate." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at Roberto. He looked at me. The secrets were out of the envelopes, but they weren't done with us yet. "Who called the police?" Alina asked, panic rising in her voice. "I didn't call them," I said, clutching my chest. Roberto walked to the window and peered through the heavy velvet curtains. He turned back to us, his face pale. "It's not just the police, Mom. It's the family lawyer, and he's not alone." I gripped the edge of the table. The timing was too precise. The ghost at the end of the table seemed to be laughing again. Even from the grave, my husband had safeguards. He had eyes everywhere. Had he known? Had he left a final trap for us, triggered by the very truth I had just revealed? "Let them in," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. I was done hiding. I had 5 children who finally knew who they were. Let the world come. We were ready. Or so I hoped. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a groan that sounded like a warning. The hallway light spilled into the dim dining room, blinding us for a fleeting second. Into our sanctuary of shattered truths and tear-stained napkins walked Mr. Vance, the family lawyer, flanked by two uniformed police officers. Vance looked exactly as he always had, like a vulture in a three-piece suit. He was thin, sharp-nosed, and smelled of antiseptic and expensive leather. He was my husband's shadow, the man who had executed every cruel command while my husband was alive, and apparently he was still following orders. "Please, stay calm," Vance said, his voice oily and smooth, scanning the room with eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the overturned chair, the ruined cake, the red faces of my children, and finally, his gaze landed on the torn envelopes scattered on the table like dead leaves. "What is happening here?" Roberto stepped forward. He didn't button his jacket. He didn't fix his tie. He stood with his feet apart, his weight grounded, a posture I had never seen on him in the boardroom. It was a fighter's stance. Mr. Vance adjusted his glasses, looking at Roberto with a mixture of disdain and confusion. "We received a distress signal, Roberto, from the silent alarm in the study, and concerning the terms of your father's estate, I have a medical order here." He gestured to the officers, who shifted uncomfortably. They looked young, too young to be in the middle of a tragedy this old. "A medical order?" Maria asked, her voice sharp. She wiped the mascara from her cheek with the back of her hand, smearing it further, but she didn't care. "For Mom?" "Precisely," Vance said, opening his briefcase with a sharp click that echoed in the silence. The click sounded like a handcuffs locking. "Your father, in his infinite foresight, added a clause regarding Louisa's stability. He stipulated that upon her 73rd birthday, if there were signs of, shall we say, erratic behavior or emotional outbursts, an immediate competency evaluation was to be triggered to protect the assets, to protect the family legacy." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the draft from the door. Even dead, he was controlling me. He knew. Somehow, he knew that one day I would explode, and he had set a trap to catch the debris. He wanted to label my truth as madness. If they declared me incompetent, everything I had just said would be dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old woman. The DNA tests would be buried. My children would be forced back into their cages. I stood up. My legs felt weak, trembling like dry twigs, but I gripped the edge of the mahogany table until my knuckles turned white. "I am not crazy, Mr. Vance. I have never been more sane in my life." Vance looked at me with a pitying smile that made my stomach turn. He stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching on a piece of dried icing that had fallen from the cake. "Look at this room, Louisa. Look at your children. They are weeping. There is destruction. You are shouting about mechanics and bakers. I heard you from the hall. This is clearly a psychotic break. The officers are here to escort you to a facility where you can rest." He reached out a hand toward the table, toward the open envelope lying in front of Lucas, the librarian's test results. If he read that paper, if he saw the proof, he would destroy it. He would burn the house down legally before letting the scandal get out. I stopped breathing. I saw Vance's manicured fingers inches from the paper. "Don't touch that," Lucas said. His voice was quiet, but it had a steel core I hadn't heard before. Vance ignored him. He was used to being the authority. His fingertips brushed the paper. Suddenly, a hand shot out. It was large, thick, and moved with a speed that was terrifying. Roberto grabbed Vance's wrist. He didn't just hold it, he squeezed. I could see the tendons in Roberto's forearm bulge, the mechanic's strength that had been dormant for decades surging to the surface. I said, "Don't touch it," Roberto growled. The tone was low, guttural, threatening. It wasn't the voice of a CEO negotiating a merger. It was the voice of a man protecting his pack. Vance gasped, his face losing its composure. "Roberto, unhand me! This is assault! Officer!" The police officers took a step forward, their hands moving to their belts. "Step back!" Daniel shouted. My youngest, the drifter, the one who usually ran away from conflict, jumped between Roberto and the police. He held his hands up, palms open. "This is a private family matter. There is no danger here. The only danger is this lawyer trying to steal our property." "Property?" Vance sputtered, trying to wrench his arm free from Roberto's iron grip. "These papers are estate documents. If your mother is compromising the integrity of the firm with her delusions—" "She is not delusional!" Elena screamed. She stood up, knocking her chair over. The sound was loud, crashing against the floorboards. She pointed a shaking finger at the portrait of her legal father on the wall. "He was the delusional one. He lived a lie. She is the only one telling the truth." The room was a powder keg. I watched the scene unfold in slow motion. My children, who an hour ago were strangers to each other, separated by jealousy and secrets, were now forming a wall around me. The mechanic, the pianist, the baker, the librarian, the drifter. They weren't fighting for the inheritance anymore. They were fighting for me. Roberto leaned in close to Vance's face. I could smell the tension, the sweat, the old wax of the candles. "You are fired, Vance," Roberto said, his voice shaking with rage. "You and your firm. You are done." "You can't fire me," Vance hissed, though I saw fear in his eyes. "I answer to the board. I answer to the trust. And right now, the trust says your mother is a liability. If you don't let me take her, if you don't let me secure these documents, I will freeze every account you have by morning. You will be destitute, all of you. Do you hear me? The house, the cars, the allowances, gone." Silence slammed back into the room. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was the weapon my husband always used: money. The golden handcuffs. He had kept them obedient with it. He had kept me silent with it. Roberto loosened his grip on Vance's wrist, but he didn't let go. He looked back at me. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was looking at his siblings. Lucas, who needed medical insurance for his asthma. Maria, who had 3 children in private schools. Elena, who had debts. Daniel, who had nothing. They had to choose. They could let Vance take the papers, call me crazy, and keep the millions. Or they could stand by the truth, keep their new identities, and lose everything material. I wanted to tell them it was okay. I wanted to tell them to let Vance take me. I was 73. I didn't need money. I didn't want them to suffer poverty because of my confession. I opened my mouth to surrender. "Take the money," I whispered. "Let him take me. It's okay. I know the truth now. That's enough for me." "No," Maria said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. She walked around the table. She picked up her envelope. She folded it carefully and placed it in her dress pocket. She looked at Vance with a haughtiness that belonged to a queen, but a warmth that belonged to a daughter. "We don't want it," she said. Vance blinked. "Excuse me?" "We don't want the blood money," Lucas added, standing up to join her. He picked up his envelope too. He held it to his chest like a shield. "I'd rather be a poor librarian with a father who loved poetry than a rich heir to a monster." "You're bluffing," Vance sneered, rubbing his red wrist as Roberto finally shoved him away. You people can't survive a week without the estate. You don't know how to work. You don't know how to live in the real world." Roberta laughed. It was a dry, harsh sound. "Actually, Mr. Vance, I think we do." He looked at his hands again. "I think I can fix anything with an engine. Elena can bake. Maria can teach. We are not the helpless parasites he made us. We are the children of workers, survivors." Roberto turned to the police officers. "Officers, this man is trespassing. My mother is lucid. We are having a birthday party. Please remove him from our home." The older officer looked at Vance, then at the fierce, united front of my 5 children. He saw the tears, yes, but he also saw the resolve. He saw a family, messy and broken, but standing together for the first time. "Mr. Vance," the officer said, hitching up his belt, "if the homeowners want you to leave, you have to leave. We can sort out the legal paperwork tomorrow at the station. Tonight, you're disturbing the peace." Vance turned purple. "This is a mistake, a colossal mistake. You are throwing away an empire. Louisa, tell them to stop this madness." I looked at the lawyer. For 40 years, I had feared his briefcase and his cold stares. But looking at him now, past the shoulder of my son the mechanic, he looked small. He looked like a paper tiger dissolving in the rain. "Get out," I said. My voice was raspy, worn out from crying, but it carried across the room. "Get out of my house, and take his ghost with you." Vance grabbed his briefcase, his hands shaking with fury. "You will regret this! You will all reside in the gutter!" he spat as he marched toward the door. The police followed him out, casting one last confused glance at the ruined cake and the crying old woman at the head of the table. The heavy doors slammed shut again. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy. It was empty. The threat was gone, but so was the safety net. We stood there, the 6 of us, amidst the wreckage of a dynasty. The chandelier above flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Roberto exhaled a long, shuddering breath and leaned back against the table. He looked at me, his eyes wide with the realization of what he had just done. I just lost us the company, Mom. I just fired the lawyer and basically renounced the inheritance." "I know," I said, reaching out to touch his arm. He looked at his siblings. "We have nothing," he whispered. Daniel poured the last of the wine into his glass. He swirled it around, watching the red liquid coat the crystal. "We have the truth," he said, raising the glass. "And honestly, it tastes better than this expensive vinegar." Elena started to giggle. It was a nervous, hysterical sound, but it was infectious. She picked up a piece of the smashed cake with her fingers and ate it. "It's actually good cake," she said with her mouth full, "even if it is smashed." I looked at them, my beautiful, disinherited children. The fear of the future was there, undeniably. The world is cold and unforgiving to those without means, and I had just thrown them into the deep end. But as Lucas put his arm around Maria and Roberto unbuttoned his collar to breathe, I saw something I hadn't seen in this house since before they were born. I saw freedom. But the night wasn't over. As the adrenaline faded, a new sound drifted into the room. Not a lawyer's voice, not a police siren. It was the sound of the old grandfather clock in the hall chiming the hour. Dong, dong, dong. And then the phone rang. The landline, the one that sat on the small table in the corner, the one that nobody used anymore. It rang with a shrill, piercing cry that made us all jump. "Who could that be?" Maria asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Everyone who matters is in this room or was just kicked out of it. I stared at the phone. A terrible intuition settled in my gut. Only one person used that line. Roberto went to answer it, but I stopped him. No, I said. It's for me. I walked over to the phone. My hand hovered over the receiver. I picked it up. Hello? I said, my voice trembling. There was static on the other end. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in 50 years, a voice from the past, warm and rough like unfinished wood. Louisa? The voice asked. Is that you? I saw the police leaving. I saw the lawyer. I've been parked down the street for 3 hours. I gasped, clutching the phone with both hands. The room spun. Louisa, the voice continued, it's Antonio. The mechanic, Roberto's father. My knees gave way. I slid down the wall, the cord tangling around my fingers. My children rushed to me, shouting, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't hear them. All I could hear was the beating of my own heart and the voice of a dead man who was very much alive, waiting in the dark just outside my gate. My knees hit the floorboards with a dull thud that vibrated through my bones. The receiver was slick in my sweating palm, the cord twisting like a black snake around my wrist. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the confused shouts of my children. "Mom!" Roberto shouted, dropping to his knees beside me. He smelled of fear and expensive cologne. "Mom, are you having a heart attack? Who is on the phone? Give it to me." I clutched the phone to my chest, shaking my head violently. I couldn't speak. My throat was closed tight, choked by a sob that had been waiting half a century to escape. "Louisa," the voice on the other end said again. The static crackled, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice that used to whisper to me in the back of a garage, the voice that promised me a life we never got to live. I know it's late. I know I shouldn't be here, but I saw the police lights. I was worried. I looked up at Roberto. His face was inches from mine, etched with concern. I reached out a trembling hand and touched his cheek, tracing the jawline that was a mirror image of the man on the phone. "It's him," I whispered. My voice sounded like dry leaves scraping together. "Who?" Roberto demanded, looking around as if the ghost of my husband had re-entered the room. "Your father," I said. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was heavier than the silence after the lawyer left. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of our lungs. Elena covered her mouth with both hands. Lucas took a step back, bumping into the sideboard, making the crystal glasses chime softly. Roberto went pale. He stared at the phone in my hand as if it were a bomb. "He is outside," I managed to say, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast down my wrinkled cheeks. "He is at the gate." Roberto didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't ask for proof. He simply stood up. His movements were stiff, mechanical, like a man walking in a dream. He turned toward the hallway, toward the heavy oak front doors. "Wait," Maria said, her voice high and frightened. "You can't just... Who is he? Is he dangerous?" "He is a mechanic," Roberto said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He is just a mechanic." I let the phone drop from my hand. It clattered against the wood, the voice on the other line still tinny and distant, calling my name. I used the table leg to pull myself up. My joints ached, protesting the stress of the night, but a strange energy surged through me. I had to see him. We moved as a pack, a family of shipwrecks drifting toward a lighthouse. We walked through the grand foyer, past the marble statues and the oil paintings of ancestors who weren't really ours. Roberto threw the double doors open. The night air rushed in, cold and biting. It smelled of wet asphalt, pine needles, and the exhaust of the police cruiser that had just departed. It was the smell of the real world. We spilled out onto the porch, 6 of us, shivering in our formal wear. The driveway lights illuminated the scene in a stark yellow glow. The iron gates were still open from where the police had exited, and there, idling just beyond the property line, was a truck. It was an old Ford, battered and rusted around the wheel wells, painted a faded blue. The engine rattled with a rhythmic, healthy chug that spoke of careful maintenance despite its age. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the manicured hedges of my prison. The driver's door creaked open. A man stepped out. He was wearing work boots, dark jeans, and a flannel jacket over a gray t-shirt. He was old. Time had bent his back slightly and turned his hair the color of steel wool. But as he stepped into the light, looking up at the imposing facade of the mansion, I saw him. I saw the way he held his shoulders. I saw the grease stain on the knee of his jeans. Antonio. He looked small against the backdrop of the estate, but solid, real. He wasn't a ghost. Roberto walked down the stone steps, one by one. His Italian leather shoes clicked on the pavement. He stopped 10 feet away from the man. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak trees, sounding like whispering voices. Antonio took a step forward, his eyes scanning the group until they landed on me. He took a sharp breath, and even from this distance, I saw his eyes fill with water. Then he looked at the man standing in front of him. He looked at Roberto. For a long moment, nobody moved. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see if the connection would hold. Roberto, the CEO, the man who had commanded boardrooms and fired executives, stood with his arms hanging uselessly by his sides. He looked at Antonio's hands, large, scarred, with permanently blackened fingernails. Then he looked at his own hands. "You have my nose," Antonio said. His voice was rough, like gravel crunching under tires. Roberto swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "And your eyes," he choked out. "Mom says I have your eyes." Antonio nodded slowly. He didn't rush forward. He didn't presume. He simply stood there, a humble man in the shadow of a palace, offering himself up for judgment. "I didn't know," he said softly to Roberto. "She never told me. If I had known, I would have torn this house down brick by brick to get to you." A sob broke from Roberto's chest, a raw, ugly sound that had nothing to do with business or decorum. He took a step, stumbling slightly, and then another. Antonio opened his arms. When they collided, it wasn't graceful. It was a crash of 2 worlds. Roberto buried his face in the flannel jacket that smelled of oil and old tobacco, clutching the fabric as if it were a lifeline in a storm. Antonio held him, his big, rough hands patting Roberto's back, cradling the head of the son he had lost to a lie. "My boy," Antonio whispered, his voice carrying on the wind. "My boy." I walked down the stairs, my legs feeling lighter with every step. Maria, Lucas, Elena, and Daniel followed me. We surrounded them. There was no jealousy. There was only awe. We were witnessing the mending of a wound that had festered for 40 years. Elena reached out and touched Antonio's sleeve, tentatively. He looked at her, then at the others. He saw the red eyes, the ruined makeup, the fear of the future radiating off them. "We're in trouble, Antonio," I said, reaching the bottom of the steps. I stood before him, feeling 73 years of weight dissolve. We sent the lawyer away. We refused the money. We are destitute. Antonio looked at me. His eyes crinkled at the corners, that same warm smile that had melted my heart in 1953. He looked at the mansion, then at his battered truck. "Destitute?" he asked, releasing Roberto, but keeping a hand firmly on his shoulder. "You have 5 children who know who they are. You have your mind. You have your freedom." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They jingled, a merry sound in the heavy night. "I don't have a mansion, Louisa. I live in a 2-bedroom bungalow on the south side. The roof leaks when it rains hard, and the porch tilts to the left. But there's a pot of stew on the stove, and I have 3 sleeper sofas." He looked at Roberto, then at the rest of my children. "I can't offer you millions," he said, his voice steady and proud. "But I can teach you how to change your own oil. I can teach you how to bake bread that doesn't taste like cardboard. I can give you a home where nobody lies to you." Roberto wiped his face with his silk sleeve, ruining the fabric. He looked back at the house, at the open door where the crystal chandelier twinkled mockingly. Then he looked at the old truck. "I don't know how to fix a leak," Roberto said, his voice trembling, but a smile breaking through the tears. Antonio laughed, a deep belly laugh that warmed the cold air. "Well, I guess we start training tomorrow." I looked at my children. Maria was taking off her diamond earrings and putting them in her pocket. Lucas was loosening his tie. Daniel was already walking toward the truck, running his hand along the rusted fender with a look of appreciation. The estate, the legacy, the trust funds, it was all back there, in the cold, empty house. Out here, under the stars, we had nothing. And we had everything. I walked up to Antonio. I placed my hand in his. His skin was rough, calloused, and warm. So incredibly warm. "Happy birthday, Louisa," he whispered. I looked back one last time at the house that had been my cage. I imagined the ghost of my husband pacing the halls, furious and impotent. I imagined the lawyer fuming in his office. Let them have the marble. Let them have the gold. I squeezed Antonio's hand. "Take me home," I said. We piled into the back of the truck and the cab, sitting on laps, squeezed together, uncomfortable and undignified. As the engine roared to life and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the gates of the estate behind, I didn't look back. I watched the road ahead, illuminated by dim yellow headlights, leading us into a life that was finally, truly ours.